And now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Scott Schofield, who has made extensive use of the Fisher collections in both his own research and in his teaching, and has spent so much time with us that he has become one of the Fisher family. Scott received his PhD in English in 2010 from the University of Toronto. An expert in book history, he has worked extensively on a range of related topics in the field, including the history of reading and note-taking, as well as the history of collections and libraries. He has taught undergraduate courses for the Department of English, as well as graduate courses for both the iSchool and the Book History and Print Culture program. He has recently published an article on the early reception of biblical passages in Shakespeare's Richard II, and has edited an inventory from a library of a 16th century English vicar for the Private Libraries in Renaissance England project, based out of the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington. In 2011, he was named INKE Post-Doctoral Fellow in the History and Future of the Book, and in that capacity has used his knowledge of book history to prototype models for digital reading environments. Today, he will be speaking about the Forbes collection, which is an intact 17th century nonconformist working library, which we are fortunate to have here in the Fisher, and which Scott has examined in great depth. Please welcome Scott Schofield.
We have two microphones here, so can everybody hear me? Great, okay, excellent. Before I get started, I need to say a few thank yous as well. And I must start with Ann Dotterman, who just introduced me. Ann last year was the one who suggested I might revisit the Forbes collection, see what I find. And I'm so grateful to her that for mentioning that and that I could take her up on the offer. Also, I'd like to thank Mrs. Doreen Seltzer, who sponsors this wonderful series and has allowed me to be part of it tonight. Another person who needs to be noted is Elizabeth Ann Yotch. Elizabeth Ann was a librarian here at the Fisher and was responsible for cataloging all the items in the Forbes collection. She, therefore, is, like myself, committed in a way that borders on obsession. I'd also like to thank members of the Fisher staff, including Pierce Carefoot, for helping me with some of the Latin inscriptions, and for the many individuals who've tied and retied books for me. And finally, many of you out there tonight who I'm not naming, but who have played a major role in my life, I thank you. To begin. In the summer of 1966, some 7 years before this remarkable space we sit in tonight was erected, the University of Toronto purchased an important collection of books. In the president's report for that year, the then chief librarian, Robert Blackburn, explained, and I quote, "Our outstanding purchase was the Forbes Library, a large collection of 16th and 17th century English books and 20 manuscripts collected in the late 16th century by a nonconformist minister whose name and library received mention in the Dictionary of National Biography. Outstanding indeed, but the description here offers but a glimpse of the library's scope. A library of 1,300 books, 1,100 regular-sized quartos, octavos, and the like, 200 larger folios, all with Forbes' initials and motto. While many of these books are English, there are also early continental imprints. The library also contains more than 200 printed pamphlets and a vast range of manuscript, including notes on sermons, book lists with prices, and even a diary for James's brother John. As Peter Hayworth remarked in his 1970 article on the Forbes collection in The Book Collector, this was a period library, undiluted by later accretions. Indeed, fewer than 10 books in the collection were entered after Forbes' death, and so what we have before us is a representative period collection, a 17th century library within a 20th century one. This fact is amazing, for the Forbes Library has always been on the move and under threat. Tensions brewed with Forbes's parishioners after his death, and those theological differences meant that the library, by agreement, went with the members who seceded. By the 19th century, it had found its way to the Southgate Chapel in Gloucester, the books being stored in the meeting room. The roof of that room would catch fire during an attack in World War II, and the books, while saved, would suffer extensive water damage. In 1954, the collection would move once again, this time to Gloucester City Library, and just more than a decade later, across the Atlantic to Toronto. The library seems to have settled, at least for now. Tonight I'll approach the Forbes Library from a series of vantage points, starting with a brief overview of the man behind the books, then turning to the library and its holdings, and finally ending with a close study of particular books. While I will begin large, gesturing towards politics and religion, my real interest is the focus on select examples I've encountered as I scrutinized one by one all of the 1,500 plus objects in the collection. In doing so, I hope to draw attention to the material evidence found in these books, for that evidence sheds light on both Forbes' own life, his collecting habits, his social networks, and on larger book history issues, binding practices, print production, and the like. Before I do this, however, I should remind you that the Forbes Library, within the Fisher Rare Book Library, is literally above us, directly in line with tonight's seating arrangement. So in addition to speaking to you, I speak to the books once owned by James Forbes. That's a bit daunting, by the way. James Forbes was born in Scotland circa 1629. We know almost nothing of his early life, but we do know that he attended and received his MA from the University of Aberdeen before proceeding to Oxford to continue studies. In 1654, he was called to Gloucester and offered the job as minister. As Forbes explains in his posthumous autobiographical account, a farewell letter of advice, he was to accept the offer, but with conditions. I could not, he says, accept the call to be a parochial minister. For if I receive the parish maintenance from all would expect to have me baptize their children and administer the Lord's Supper to all according to long custom. This was against my conscience. Forbes's compromise was to serve as lecturer and weekly preacher at the Gloucester Cathedral. For 6 years he maintained this position. But with the restoration of Charles II in 1660, Forbes found himself in a storm of trouble. And I quote, "I was turned out of my public place and deprived of maintenance. I was complimented with great offers if I would conform, but if not, I was solemnly forbid to preach to the diocese." And he continues, "So I went on preaching and was twice imprisoned. My second imprisonment continued 12 months, after which I did, with consent of the congregation, removed to London." London would not bring comfort, however. And as Forbes tells us, he would barely escape the plague of 1665 and the Great Fire a year later. What follows in the coming years is uncertain, but in 1672 he returned to Gloucester, only to be confronted again by the authorities, fined £20 per month, and then excommunicated. But in the midst of these troubles, somehow Forbes found a way to his flock. Here, Forbes writes, "I had 5 years' quiet exercise of my ministry, wonderfully hid, when others in most places round about us were in great trouble." The record goes quiet again until 1687, when Forbes tells us, the quote, "Church desired his return, and so he came back." From 1687 until his death in 1712, Forbes would continue as a nonconformist minister in Gloucester. Just how peaceful or restless those years were is difficult to determine, for Forbes remains quiet on the subject. But one thing seems clear. Forbes kept his library, and he regularly added to it. Incomplete as Forbes's narrative may be, it nevertheless speaks to a fairly common phenomena of the time. Several ministers, often designated as nonconformists or dissenting, who thrived in the years of the civil wars and interregnum, 1649 to 60, found themselves facing allegations, fines, even imprisonment after the restoration of Charles. Many of those ministers, like Forbes, relocated to London during these years, But how did these ministers keep in contact with one another during and after these turbulent years? Forbes is rather quiet on the subject. There are no ministers, nonconformist or other, mentioned in any detail in his published works, nor is there any similar mention of ministers in the manuscript material at the Fisher. The only exception I know of comes in a letter by Daniel Defoe, the famous author of such works as Robinson Crusoe and Moll Flanders, in which he explains that a high-ranking British politician, Robert Harley, was acquainted with Forbes. Harley had used Defoe as an agent for the distribution of propaganda in the years 1704 to 6, and as Pat Rogers has shown, a large contingent of the men Defoe chose as agents throughout England were dissenting ministers, including independents. While Forbes is not listed in that list of agents Defoe sent to Harley, it is possible that he was aware of the secret campaign, if not complicit to it. Forbes was definitely familiar with the political writings of Daniel Defoe, as his library includes 4 of Defoe's political pamphlets of 1704, including the Dissenters' Answer to the High Church and a new test of the Church of England's honesty. But who else? Outside of this one rather foggy reference in a Defoe letter, we know almost nothing else about Forbes' acquaintances or his larger social network. Might his library offer clues? Perhaps, since more than 50 books in the collection include gift inscriptions by Forbes. Ex dono autoris reverende, the gift of the reverend author, can be found on numerous flyleaves in Forbes' distinctive hand. This repeated inscription can be found in works by men such as the Bristol preacher Strickland Goff, who donated a copy of his sermons on effectual calling of 1709 to Forbes, or the London preacher Thomas Doolittle, who gave a copy of his 1697 treatise on the Lord's Supper. William Owens gave Forbes a larger folio, and Forbes had 23 of Owens' works in his library. Thomas Gilbert offered Forbes a book on metaphysics, while Joseph Allen gave Forbes a large folio on the key to the scriptures. While most of Forbes' gifts inscriptions are the same, others, like the gift inscription for Joseph Allen, reads, and I translate the Latin, "the gift from my most beloved friend." Forbes offers an even longer, more intimate gift inscription for the London minister William Greenhill, one of the men who had served Oliver Cromwell at the Westminster Assembly. In Forbes' copy of Greenhill's 1662 commentary on Ezekiel to Forbes he writes, and I translate again, the gift from a reverend author who is learned and humble, affable, gentle, without guile, a Nathaniel. That the reference to Greenhill is in the past tense suggests that Forbes is making the record of the gift sometime after Greenhill's death in 1671. His reference to Greenhill as without guile, a Nathaniel, is also telling, for it is taken directly from Scripture, from John 1:47, and perhaps most surprising for a Protestant, his Latin is straight from the Vulgate. How are we to interpret the gift inscriptions recorded by Forbes in his books? Might they offer clues to a larger social network? One thing that seems more than coincidental is that most of the authors who presented their works or the works of others to Forbes were also independent ministers. And like Forbes, all of them had been ejected following the Act of Uniformity in 1662. Moreover, in addition to those who presented books to Forbes, there are others like the ejected minister Hazelfoot Bridges. There's a name for you, Hazelfoot, who may have had contact with Forbes. 3 of Bridges' books are in the Forbes collection, and so too are their books once belonging to William Voyle, the minister who preached out of Hereford Cathedral until he was ejected after the Restoration. Perhaps the most interesting of mysterious donors of books to Forbes, however, is one Thomas Browne. No less than 22 books in the Forbes collection contain inscriptions by Browne, and more than half of these are recorded by Forbes as gifts. But which Thomas Browne? Well, there is only one Hazelfoot Bridges. There are many Thomas Brownes. The royalist clergyman seems an unlikely candidate as friend. Could this be from the famous physician and author of Religio Medici? Or are they from the largely unknown nonconformist minister from Hampshire? The verdict is still out for searching Thomas Browne's is much like trying to find John Smith of Toronto. When we look to Forbes' few publications, as well as the remains of correspondence relating to him, we could easily conclude that Forbes kept to himself, avoided engaging with the larger network of independent ministers across England. But the books tell another story. They speak of a man in contact with a network of independent ministers in England. How that contact occurred and when is difficult to pin down, but contact was clearly made. And here we just see on this rather simple Google map some of the locations, or the dominant locations of those independent ministers that Forbes was in contact with. So we have this sort of south central section of England that comes to dominate. And places like London seem to have 6, 8, sometimes 10 possible acquaintances, where other places only one. Other associations found in Forbes's books, however, are more difficult to discern. For example, how familiar was Forbes with Gilbert Burnet, the author of the incredibly popular History of the Reformation of the Church of England? A copy of Burnet's brother's medical treatise of 1673 carries a gift donation by Gilbert Burnet. And what was the relationship between Forbes and John Prideaux, the staunchly royalist Regius Professor of Divinity at Exeter College, and by 1641, Bishop of Worcester? 3 books in Forbes's collection carry Prideaux's name, one of them a particularly interesting presentation copy. The copy shown here was presented by John Latius to John Prideaux. Prideaux then signed the title page, as did his son-in-law. As the entry on Prideaux in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography explains, Prideaux's will stipulated that his library be divided between his 2 son-in-laws, one of whom was named Henry Sutton. Sutton has ingeniously signed his name in the loop of Prideaux's J. The entry for Prideaux goes on to note that more than 600 of Prideaux's books are now housed in Worcester Cathedral. We might add that at least 3 others are in Toronto. And there we see Henry Sutton, 1655. It is likely, therefore, that many of Forbes' books were purchased, some given as gifts, and others accumulated through inheritance in a myriad of other ways. While we may not always know how a book arrived to the Forbes library, the list of names I've recovered through inscriptions on flyleaves and title pages offers a new set of leads for future investigations. Search the archives relating to Gilbert Burnet, John Prideaux, and you may find mention of James Forbes. Simple inscription offers rich potential. In the immediate years following the arrival of the Forbes collection to Canada, Toronto scholars were all abuzz about its holdings. Peter Hayworth would write 2 articles on the subject, while the Bulletin, Renaissance, and Reformation would devote an entire issue to the collection. In that November 1968 issue, Michael Finlayson, Natalie Zeman Davis, and David Sinclair would all produce articles. That issue would also contain an unrelated piece on microfilm archives from the Vatican by a young up-and-comer named Richard Landon. A central concern of this early work on Forbes was its contents. How many books? What kinds? Michael Finlayson, who focused primarily on English Protestant works in the collection, particularly the 16th century material, was convinced that parts of the library had been dispersed. How, he wondered, could the library of a Scottish-born Calvinist contain so little Calvin, so little Knox? In an even more detailed article, Natalie Zeman Davis focused on the pre-1611 imprints and noted that 86 of the 125 were continental in origin. That these continental books were entirely in Latin suggests Forbes was likely not fluent in the continental vernaculars, French, German, Italian, Spanish. That they were mainly biblical commentaries and sermons was a reminder of the practical function of his library. What neither of these articles nor the articles by Hayworth look at in any detail, however, is what dominates the collection. That is, English imprints and pamphlets published during Forbes' own lifetime, especially the works produced between 1640 and 1710. What might explain the absence of Calvin or Knox, for example, is that both writers' teachings had been absorbed and newly transformed through a new generation of divines. The dominant players of history have a way of obscuring our expectations. They can make us forget the importance of what is current at a given moment. Consider, for example, the letter B in Forbes' library. One might expect to find Beza and Bullinger, and we do, but in small quantities. But instead, what we find is Baxter, Bunyan, Burgess, and Burroughs. There are more than 50 works by Richard Baxter in Forbes' collection, 11 by Burgess, 4 by Bunyan, and 15 by Jeremiah Burroughs. The works of Burroughs, which were largely published in the 1650s during the interregnum, contain titles that could have come straight out of a modern horror film. Consider The Evil of Evils or The Sinfulness of Sin. That we find these kinds of works in Forbes' library makes sense. Baxter and Burroughs, those with the most representation, were, like Forbes, independent ministers. And so, unsurprisingly, their like-minded ideas are strongly represented here. Other libraries belonging to nonconformists in the period offer similar tales. The detailed inventory of the 6,000 books kept by the nonconformist Samuel Jeake of Rye, while different in some ways from Forbes' library, nevertheless contains many of the same authors we just saw under B. So too does the recently edited library of 1,700 books, once belonging to Roger Morris. Independents like Forbes subscribe neither to the Anglican or Presbyterian models, believing that each church should have its own unique governance. We often use this term Puritan or dissenter to describe such men, but in doing so we simplify the particular strands of Protestantism active in the period. Let's not forget that one of Forbes' publications is a critique of the writings of the Quaker John Eliot. As an independent, Forbes' understanding of the church finds a closer analog to the early American Congregationalist church, and that structure can be traced as far back as 17th century New England. Not surprisingly, then, many of the works in Forbes' library were the same ones found in early New England libraries. As Matthew Browne has taught us, much of early American literature was early English devotional literature. Scour the probate inventories of early American wills, and you will find that the works of Baxter and related authors found in Forbes' collections come to dominate. While there is good reason to compare Forbes' collection with other English examples, it may also make sense to look to those early American settlers who either carried similar books with them across the Atlantic or purchased American editions of those popular London imprints. The libraries they formed were very much in the spirit of Forbes. Forbes' library also contains a number of educational works, including grammars and dictionaries in Latin, Greek, and English. And while the short supply of Calvin and Knox is somewhat surprising, the presence of Catholic works in Forbes' collections is even more so. How do we explain his owning a copy of the Vulgate, works by Aquinas, or a commentary on Pelagius? One answer is found in the proverbial phrase, "Know thine enemy," but another lies in the fact that libraries are complex phenomena, at once indicators of individual tastes and beliefs of their owner, and yet in other ways the opposite of that very individual. Before we conclude that the presence or absence of a work in a library is typical, we must remember that books in libraries were often on the move, borrowed and circulated, sometimes destroyed and seized. As Giles Mandelbrot has shown, Richard Baxter lost his library after being ejected at the Restoration. And while he built up an additional 1,400 books, how much of it reflected the old is impossible to know. Mandelbrot goes on to show the problem of using a library as a barometer of intellectual interest by focusing on the library of Sir Isaac Newton. Many of the most influential works by John Wallis, a major influence on Newton, are absent, but they can be found in his close friend Isaac Barrow's library. When Forbes died, he made provisions for his books to be borrowed to teach dissenting ministers. One can't help but think that some of this kind of movement was happening during Forbes' lifetime and after, and therefore some of the books from his library remain unreturned. Studies of early libraries typically follow two kinds of trajectory. In the first instance, scholars place their emphasis on the collection, looking carefully at the contents, often comparing how typical the holdings are to other surviving examples from the period. In the second instance, the emphasis is placed on the individual collector. In this case, the library functions as a source of evidence for measuring an owner's beliefs, political, religious, etc., his or her tastes. Did she collect literature or science, perhaps both? In most cases, however, scholars flip-flop back and forth between collector and collection, often examining each to answer a wider array of interrelated questions. But what if we take the emphasis off of both? Let's forget that these are Forbes' books, and let's even ignore their contents. With owner, author, subject removed, we are invited to consider how the books were constructed and how they were used. There is much to learn from looking beyond Forbes. When 16th and 17th century imprints were dispersed or sold at auction, their new owners often had them rebound. This was especially common from the 18th century to the mid-20th, as collectors routinely renovated books, often tossing away early bindings and end papers in the process, cropping edges, and valuable annotations left in the margin. In some instances, the old books were newly bound in goatskin, often termed Morocco, complete with marbled end papers and matching paste downs. The Fisher's copy of the first printed Aldine edition of Castiglione's famous work, The Courtier, seen here, illustrates my point. This copy, which was rebound in 19th century by the English bindery Riviera, is designed for a collector, bound in red Morocco, with gold tooled fillets, corner ornaments. It also contains a matching centerpiece of the famous Aldine device of the dolphin and anchor. Beautiful as this book may be, its beauty has come with a price. By replacing its earlier binding and original end papers, the Riviera bindery erased important evidence of the book's history of ownership and use. No book in the Forbes collection looks like this. In fact, many of the books in this library are falling apart. Often brittle and often tied, these often unexceptional looking bindings of limp vellum, calf, and or sheep nevertheless often carry secrets, and many of those secrets are found in what those in the book trade call waste. Waste is the technical term for discarded print or manuscript used in the binding's construction, especially to reinforce the spine and to protect the text block. Seen from our vantage, we might think of it as a form of early modern recycling. In some instances, the waste is barely noticeable, often present at the edges of the boards or title page. You can see here just that thin layer of medieval manuscript between the title page and the first flyleaf. In other cases, however, the waste is much more difficult to ignore. Here, in this example, we see that whole leaves of waste have been used to protect the print block. The text, the printed text to the left, is just waste paper being used to wrap the book. But why does it matter? Consider, for example, Forbes' copy of the 1530 edition of Erasmus's Adagia. At its front and back are significant fragments of medieval manuscript, complete with decorative initials and commentary. Vellum, which this is produced on, is a particularly strong material, and so fragments such as these offered the binder an excellent material for holding the print block together. Vellum is also expensive, and so cutting up medieval manuscripts for binding, terrifying as it may seem now, made economical sense at the time. These fragments are taken from a circa 13th or 14th century manuscript of Justinian's Digest, one of the most popular of early legal texts. Pretty cool, eh? But hopefully more than that. Consider the book's boards, the repeated tooled panels on the dark calf binding tells me it was bound in Oxford in the 1530s or 40s. Neil Kerr and more recently David Pearson have described in detail the physical and decorative feature of Oxford bindings in the 16th century, and they also index the particular kinds of waste found in individual examples. Several surviving Oxford bindings from the same period contain fragments from Justinian's Digest, and it is not unlikely that some of those fragments, including the one found in the Forbes book, likely derive from the same medieval manuscript. With some work, one could imagine a digital reconstruction project, one where fragments of this kind are pulled together to recreate sections of the original uncut manuscript. In this example, the binder's waste is at once, then, an act of destruction and an act of preservation. There are approximately 20 such bindings in the Forbes collection, and so the possibilities here are quite rich. A similar example can be seen in Forbes 00244. This is how I encounter the books. Here, this simple 1607 imprint is bound in a vellum wrapper. Open the cover, and you will find that it is enclosed in printed waste. We've already seen some of this before. But the binding in this case is itself a document, for its inner lining contains manuscript of an Elizabethan indenture. And there you can see the binding. Previously, a manuscript document has been recycled here as the vellum wrapper binding. I could only do this with this book. If I did it with any other, I'd get in big trouble. The print block had come off, so I was able to get away with it. Who could imagine that early modern legal text would be used in such a way? And what are the larger implications of studying the book as palimpsest? Some of the bindings in the Forbes also preserve scarce text. The two examples shown here, both paste downs, I'll show you the first, are taken from newspapers and periodical literature produced during the Civil War era, 1650s, material that is now classified as Thompson tract material. Such material is quite rare. The news then as now comes and goes, gets stale quickly, and therefore it is not surprising to see it here recycled. Here's the second one. Next, we see fragments of a 17th century play by Thomas Heywood. And here, whole sheets of incunabula waste, and as books produced in the 15th century. Both incunabula and early play quartos are highly sought after by the respective scholars, and so even fragments will be of interest. What about this example? Here the waste is a section from an uncut early 17th century English printed sheet. For those trained in bibliography, you'll remember that books begin not as consecutive pages, but as sheets, which are then folded, cut, and stitched. Such an example as this helps us to illustrate what is often left to the imagination. But this particular uncut fragment is particularly exciting. The work in question, a meditation upon the Lord's Prayer, is attributed to King James I, the first edition being printed in 1619. I have looked at that edition online, and while I can find the corresponding text for page 73, it is found on page 124 and in a different font. In other words, this may be the only known fragment from what is a lost edition. Since I still have you in the printer's shop, thinking in terms of sheets rather than pages, let's move from London to Oxford to consider the printing of that landmark work by Robert Burton, The Anatomy of Melancholy. First published in 1621, The Anatomy was continuously revised by Burton over several editions for nearly 20 years. For example, the second edition of 1624 contained an additional 70,000 words, and the trend would continue for both the third edition of 1628 and the fourth of 1632. The 1632 edition is of particular interest to scholars, for it is argued to be the one most carefully overseen by Burton himself. As the editors of the Oxford edition note, it contains more than 98% of the text found in the next two editions, a more stable orthography, but perhaps most of all, clear evidence of Burton's editing. So needless to say, I was rather excited to find some waste of Burton's anatomy in one of the large folios in Forbes's collection. That it came from the 1632 edition made it even more intriguing. However, I was also a bit puzzled, for unlike the other printed waste I had seen, this example was annotated in an early hand. You can see the marks up and down the side margin of each of those pieces. Who takes notes on waste, I wondered. That is when it occurred to me these uncut sheets were what is known as proof sheets. Before the full run of a single form began, a printer in the hand press period demanded that it be given 3 proofs. This could fluctuate, of course. When the sample sheet was pulled on each occasion, it would be checked for errors. Either the author or corrector was required to address those errors relating to spelling and syntax. The corrector, who would have been trained in various languages, especially Latin and often Greek, would check it for errors and mark those errors on the proof sheet. The compositors, however, might also check the sheet for accuracy and alignment against a copy prepared by the author or corrector, and the author was often involved in the process. In other words, lots of eyes overseeing at different times. Well, more detailed study is needed here. There are a few things I can deduce. The corrections on the uncut sheet address errors that existed in the third edition, 1628. But they also address errors newly introduced with this printing, the correcting of the causes of love melancholy to beauty a cause is simply because someone screwed up. Beauty a cause already existed as a headline at the section in the previous edition. But some of the more finite changes, spellings and changes to references in the side notes, address errors that existed in the previous edition. My best guess is that this is a correction to the first or second proof sheet, a case where old errors and newly introduced ones have been addressed simultaneously. More evidence from Oxford comes in another of Forbes's books, this time a 1607 imprint bound at Oxford. Tucked away in the binding are the business records of two early modern stationers. Here, the London printer to King James I, John Bill, later printer to King James, explains to John Crosley how the following books will arrive shortly to Oxford. Such records as these are extremely rare, and David Pearson points to only one other example of a document with equivalent detailed stationery correspondence used as waste, and this after searching and studying the waste found in hundreds of Oxford bindings. One last example. At first glance, the Forbes copy of Thomas Brighton's Latin commentary on the Book of Revelation seems an interesting, but not entirely unusual example of a well-annotated text. As with many surviving books from this period, Forbes's copy of Brightman's text has been littered with annotations, underlinings, and a myriad of symbols for marking and indexing passages. Look more closely, however, and you will discover that these are not your run-of-the-mill readerly annotations. Instead, this is like the annotations to Burton's text, printer's copy, but on a much larger scale. The title page of the Brightman copy offers the first clue. The word perlegia, the Latin for read through or examine thoroughly, has been written by the corrector and again at the end of the text. What we have here then is a copy for a new edition, but there was no new edition, or at least not a new one published by Hulsius at Frankfurt. I'm still awaiting for images from a 1612 edition printed elsewhere in Germany to see if the Frankfurt edition was proofed for this later version of Brightman's text. But in the meantime, I'm left with an amazing example of the 17th century editor at work. How do we measure a library? In meters or feet? By content? Or in the traces of human contact left in books? There's no right answer to this question, only answers. Seen from afar, libraries appear static things, but when examined up close, they begin to reveal their social transactions. The Forbes Library is especially rich in its human remains. Study the end papers of individual books, and you will find James Forbes's friends, acquaintances, a previously unknown social network. Enumerate the library's holdings, and you will find an up-to-date collection of titles, a nonconformist in touch with the most popular writings of his day. Search the bindings of books in the Forbes collection, and you forget Forbes, but you'll be invited to study the inner workings of early modern printing, editing, and a whole range of other mysteries of the stationer's world. We all know that moment when in search for one thing we stumble upon another, unrelated find. Such moments are normally labeled serendipity, for they are often deemed the product of chance encounter. But such an assertion simplifies such acts, for discoveries, even unexpected ones, often come from being in the right place at the right time. The many fascinating finds I have made in the Forbes collection have come from my commitment to examining closely all 1,500 books, in hand, one by one, over a 3-week period. This included untying and retying many fragile items. Also focusing exclusively on the marks of ownership, those inscriptions, bindings, and other evidence of human use, rather than simply on the author, title, and subject of the books. In taking these steps, any discoveries I made were not, I believe, so much serendipity, but rather probable outcome. To understand a library, especially one that archives such rich human contact as the Forbes Library does, requires that you inspect it up close. It has been 42 years since someone has published on Forbes. And so I hope others will join me, get their hands dirty, and dive into the richness of this library within the library. Thank you. I keep thinking on my tabs. Yeah, of course.
I think we have time for some questions. It's marvelous what you can find out by looking closely at some books. So please, I think Scott would be happy to answer questions.
Please.
Having a couple of books myself that have this sort of discarded waste.
Uh-huh.
Why did that happen? I mean, I had no understanding of it, but was there a shortage of paper? I mean, what was the...
Well, there could be any number of reasons for it. I mean, the manuscript waste is a bit different, especially the medieval manuscript waste, where you are literally taking, these early manuscripts that are seen as old. I mean, that's one argument for it. It can be more complex than that, but often seen as old. A new edition comes out. Think of it as how you look at perhaps a 1970s paperback. You might see it and say, oh, that's all right, but I'll take the 2012 one. You know, there's a bit of that to why the manuscript waste. The printed stuff is a bit different. Sometimes, as we saw in the Burden case, this is just process, left over. Part of the that's not going into a book, so it's part of the mistakes. Those sheets are left over. The binders of books say, well, that's going to help reinforce my binding. It's very practical. At one level, it's purely economical, and perhaps the most important level. There are other reasons too, but those are the dominant ones. Yeah. Marjorie.
So we have thankfully, these wonderful digital archives of early modern printed books that are always getting larger for us.
Mm-hmm.
It's a wonderful resource. But your talk displays to me how little we have of those printed books once we're looking at them, because very rarely we have images of all of this waste material.
Yeah.
And even less rarely do we have any information about what's there that
Mm-hmm.
you're providing us. So what's the future for digital archives
Ooh.
and this kind of important, the reading of this waste material in digital archives?
At least you don't ask big questions. I think, on one level, nothing beats touching the book, turning it sideways, holding it in your hand, feeling what calf feels like versus vellum. There are sensory experiments, of course, taking place in the digital realm, and those will come in time. Whether they replace or come close to that moment, I'm not sure. But I do think it starts with a commitment to what your protocols are for digitization. Some of the earliest efforts of digitization of early books left this material out. You start on the title page and you move forward, and it was deemed, well, that's superfluous. We don't need that junk. It just gets in the way of Shakespeare or whoever it might be. But we're starting to see that change, and one of the major projects of this kind is at the Staatsbibliothek in Munich. It's known as the VD series. They did the Incunabula, the VD16, the 16th century books, and 17th century German. And their digitization starts with, it starts with the outer boards of the binding. It moves to the waste. It captures everything. One thing I would like to see more of is three-dimensional capture, so that we're not just looking at books flat, but how do they look from the side? Sometimes on the sides, the foredge of the book, you'll find manuscript titles. We assume that books are shelved spine out, but that took some time. I mean, it wasn't universal until later centuries. So capturing it three-dimensional, being able to move the book in certain ways would be one way of doing that. The other part of that question involves institutional cooperation. I think one of the greatest challenges in digitization efforts is how to bring together collections like this one with other collections. How does my copy link, for instance, to this copy at the Folger Shakespeare Library, or the one at the Huntington, the one at the BL, Yale, Princeton, and the like? There should be moves in that direction. There are some moves, but they're small. There's still those barriers that prevent it to a certain degree. But somebody who wants to study and make that decision whether they have to go and travel and see the thing in the flesh, or if the digital surrogate will suffice, could start at least by having those grouped in a similar place. Does that help? Good. Okay. Thanks.
Could I just say something
Oh,
about
sure.
that too?
Yeah.
I would just say as well, don't be satisfied by looking at just one copy.
Right, I mean, it puts us on planes very often.
Well,
you know,
no, I know,
which is lovely, but,
but,
I think Scott's got a vision for us.
yeah, for sure.
You mentioned that some of the waste is inconagula.
Yeah.
How would you possibly identify a small fragment of inconagula?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you. I mean, identifying any of this waste is happens a lot more quickly now because of the digital environment. I type in phrases on the waste, and you'd be amazed what you find. I found a lot of the STC waste not looking on Ebo, but looking on Google. And especially those two pieces I showed you from the 17th century news pamphlets. I was just trying fragments of search terms, and amazingly I found them eventually, and they're very hard to find. But the incunabula waste, the one I showed, the big, large, uncut sheet, I just happened to get the last pages, so it has the colophon. The colophon with the printer's name and the date, and so that helped me right away. But in other cases, I have 3 others that I plan to give to PJ at some point and get him looking, because I'm stumped. And some of the texts you just don't know. I mean, the other thing, too, is it's not as much, in some cases, of course, you have the digitization of the image, but whether the text has been transcribed somewhere, you know. But having said that, you know, comparing it, what we can do now with the search engines and search availability we have versus, say, 20 years ago, it's quite remarkable what we can find quickly. I often looked at some of those books, typed in on Google, and within a minute had it worked out. Other times I'd be at 30 minutes and say, okay, that's enough, next book. Thank you. Randy.
Thanks, Scott, for a wonderful talk. You talked about war damage and fire.
Yeah.
Are the books singed in any way? And how is water damage done? Are they compromised? Are they fragile?
Yeah, I'll start with the fire. That piece of waste, I might be able to find it. It's not that far back. At least my memory tells me it's not. There we go. That one looks like it was a fire piece. This piece of Haywood. Play cordial waste, by the way, is, you know, people get all revved up for that. I mean, play cordials are very much sought after. But this one looks like it's been in the fire. The water damage, first of all, it seemed to have occurred as a result of the fire. The firemen at one of the Gloucester buildings, the story goes, came in and just put too much water on it. And put out the fire, but also drenched the books. It's hard to tell now. There are some signs of mold in some of them. Nothing that looks too dangerous, but it's definitely made it more brittle. And a lot of the one thing that has happened, and it's a question I don't have an answer to, is these books were rebacked. A lot of them were rebacked. The spines at some point, and I'm not entirely sure when. It could be 18th, could be 19th century. But the rest was kept, which makes me so happy. The waste papers and all that sort of material that often carries the provenance and details of ownership. Oh, hi.
It boggles my mind how he could even keep his collection together in his lifetime during his travel. I hop back to my father's collection or mother's and counting down some of these books we can't afford to lose them. Did he seem to collect most of it during 7 periods? Can you tell? I mean, during
It's very hard. I mean, you can look at imprint dates, but who knows? You could buy a 1660 imprint in 1690. Having said that, Forbes, one of the arguments I was making was that he's very up to date. He seems to be interested in what's current, in the number of pamphlets. He's not alone in this period. And so my feeling is a lot of that material comes fairly soon after it's published, especially the material between 1650 and 1710. A lot of it's a blank, though. We don't know how but it is for me, it's the remarkable story. A lot of nonconformist libraries were simply seized after the Restoration. So the fact that this, from what we know, has stayed together, more or less as is in itself amazing. But yeah, I have a bit more work could answer some of those questions, especially as I'm working at the London contacts. I'm starting to think that some of those books are coming during those moves, during those moments. And then, maybe I don't know how many books you can feasibly carry with you in the late 17th century in a wagon or whatever, and especially if you're constantly looking over your shoulder for the authorities. But that's one dent. When I return, I'll start answering that kind of question. Thank you.